What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. We are talking today about two of the potentially biggest names that are going to be moved this NBA trade deadline. That is Giannis and Anthony Davis. Two of the best, at least when healthy, and that's obviously a big caveat for both of these guys, but two of the best players in the league. And both players have been in rumors really for the last 12 months. Are they going to get traded? I'm going to talk about them individually. We're going to start with Giannis, then go to Anthony Davis. I would be surprised if both of these guys are on their teams at the start of next season. Now, that doesn't mean I necessarily think both these guys are going to get traded at the trade deadline. And in Giannis's case, I think that's probably pretty slim now. But I do think at the start of next season, both guys will be on new teams. So whether that's this deadline, whether that's in the offseason, we're going to go over every potential trade. We're going to go through all the teams for each guy and see what makes the most sense. So let's actually just jump right in, because this might be a long video going through all potential trades for these two. As always, if you like this video, hit that subscribe button. I might be doing a couple more of these with other players if you're interested. I also got my NBA trade value rankings coming out later this month. So lots of things coming. Hit that subscribe button. And with that, let's start with Giannis. We're going to do him first. As I said at the top, I don't think he gets moved this deadline. Besides last year with Luka, we rarely see players of this caliber get moved at the deadline. This seems like probably an offseason move. But as I said, I don't think he will be on the Bucks come the start of next season. So whether that's this deadline, whether that's this offseason, one of these trades I think is going to happen. So let's go through all the potential options. Here are all 29 teams that Giannis could get traded to. I'm not going to go through every single team, because obviously that would be a really long video. We'd be here for hours going through every potential trade for every team. And that's just not realistic. He's not going to go to all of these teams. So let's do a little process of elimination. Let's get rid of some of these teams you see here. The first question, if you're a team wanting Giannis, is does Giannis actually fit your timeline? If you're a rebuilding team, there's no point in just spending a ton of assets for Giannis. So we can remove 11 teams just like that. Only team I would say maybe would be the Pacers, because obviously they just made the finals last year. Not a good year this year, but you could argue Halliburton and Giannis together would be a fun pairing. But I think the rest, pretty self-explanatory. No point really in them trading for Giannis. The next question is, do you need Giannis's skill set? And I say this specifically, do you need his skill set? Not do you need Giannis? Because every team needs Giannis. And I'm not saying that some of these teams that are here wouldn't need Giannis. Every team would want him. Every team would need him. He's one of the probably still 5 best players when he's healthy. But do you specifically need his skill set? But I'm going to eliminate a couple teams. I'm going to eliminate the Magic, the 76ers, and the Nuggets. Those 3 teams, of course, would love Giannis. And the Magic in particular have been a somewhat popular rumor destination, with them either trading Franz or Paolo. I don't really see the Magic doing that at this point, which is why I crossed them off. Giannis obviously plays the same position, so one of those two would have to get traded. That could happen, which is why it's a popular rumor. I don't see that happening right now. I don't see the Magic going for it. And then the last criteria that would eliminate a couple more teams is, do you have pieces the Bucks would want? And could you still do that while having a good team left over? Because for a couple of these teams, you'd have some pieces, but then you would fall into the bucket of just not good teams. Giannis wouldn't want to go there. I'm taking out the Suns, I'm taking out the Trailblazers, and I'm taking out another popular team in the Raptors. All 3 of those cases might be dark horses, and I think these 3, you could argue, would be a good Giannis trade destination. All 3 would have good pieces to send the Bucks, but I would argue once you trade some of those guys and trade whatever it takes to get Giannis, you wouldn't have a great team. You would have maybe a young and kind of fun team, but Giannis needs to go to a contender. I don't think he would want to go to one of those 3. So that leaves 12 teams remaining by my count. And we're going to go backwards in order from what I'm going to call least likely to most likely destination, because I don't think all of these are equal. The least likely to me of these 12 to get Giannis would probably be the Boston Celtics. And we're going to throw up the first trade offers of the day. I'm going to structure pretty much all of these like this. I'm going to show 2 trade offers. One basically on the side of the Bucks, kind of what the Bucks would want, and then one on the side of the team receiving Giannis, what they would prefer to give up. Realistically, the trades are going to meet in the middle, probably some sort of combination. Think of this as like first offers from both sides. And then I will also mention that a lot of these trades are pretty much just the frameworks. Some of these trades, and realistically, a Giannis trade is probably going to be a 3-team deal, at least a 3-team deal, potentially more. It's going to include a lot of picks. I can't include a ton of picks just in the frame. So a lot of these are just frameworks. Don't get mad at me if you're like, oh, why did you only include 1 pick versus 3 or 4 or 5? Think of these as frameworks, kind of the gist of the offer. You can add picks, you can add players, but for the most part, that's what it is. So that's going to be the case for all of these. Just wanted to mention that off the bat. The Celtics are first. I don't think it's likely that he goes to Boston. Only reason I mention it is if Giannis wants to actually leave, and if we get to that point where he is going to get traded, I would assume the Celtics would at least have a conversation, and they would call, because they could use a big. They could use someone to go alongside Tatum and Brown. I don't think it's realistic based on what they would offer. The Bucks, if that conversation happens, would obviously be like, hey, we want either Tatum or Brown. We think they're pretty similar value. Tatum or Brown would be younger than Giannis. That's what they would offer. Celtics obviously would come back and be like, no, we want Giannis to go along with those two. So can we put a package together led by Derek White, led by a couple nice young players, a couple first-round picks? I don't really see a path where they line up. I don't see the Celtics trading one of their big two. I don't really see the Bucks wanting a package of just kind of the rest. It's a dark horse, but they're least likely, which is why they're 12th. The next team is the San Antonio Spurs. And this is a team that a couple of months ago, I think, would have been pretty high up on the list. A lot of people thought the Giannis Wemby pairing would be great. A lot of people thought Spurs would be one of the favorites. But now, based on how their 2 young players are playing in the backcourt, Stephon Castle, Dylan Harper, I don't know if the Spurs really want to mess with what they have. And the trades that you see up here, yeah, the Bucks, rightly so, would be like, yeah, we want Harper and Castle. That would probably be their first call. Spurs, they would argue and say, no, we want to keep those 2. If you want a package full of a lot of picks, if you want, guys like Vassell, Keldon Johnson, Jeremy Sohan, if you want that, great. But if you don't, I don't think the Spurs do it. And that's kind of been the difference between the start of the year and now. Start of the year, I would have argued that the Spurs would have given up either Castle or Harper. Take your pick. They're going to be pretty similar in my trade value rankings coming out later this month. I think they would have been okay with trading one of them. But now, based on how they look, how both of those guys have performed this year, Giannis is great, and I'm not saying that they're better than Giannis, but I don't think the Spurs mess with it. So unless the Bucks are going to take just a big package of everything else, I don't think this happens. So they're down the list of probably least likely teams for Giannis. Next team up is the Houston Rockets, and this is another team that at the beginning of the year I would have said might have been pretty high. They've been a pretty big rumored team for Giannis. Similar idea to the Spurs. I don't really know if they really want to pull the trigger, and I think they want to stick with what they have. Now, the only reason I think they're a little bit more likely than the Spurs is the Rockets traded for Kevin Durant, and Kevin Durant is not young. He's 37, and obviously he looks great, but he only has probably a couple years left at this level. So if you're going to make it pretty much a win-now move in Kevin Durant, why not follow that up with Giannis and just go for it these next couple years? So that would be the only argument for why this could happen. I think if they have the conversation, the Bucks obviously ask for either Şengün or Amen Thompson. Şengün, to me, makes the most sense. Giannis and Şengün, a little bit duplicative. Amen Thompson, I think, fits a lot better with Giannis. So I think the Bucks would be happy with a Şengün-led package. I think he's probably one of the best players they could get in a Giannis deal. Rockets, obviously, similar to the Spurs, would want to keep both Şengün and Amen Thompson. They would offer, again, a package of the rest. And in the Rockets case, I think that's a little bit better than the Spurs. You could throw in Reed Shepherd. You could throw in Jabari Smith, Tari Eason, a couple first-round picks. It's not a bad package. Doesn't have a headliner, but I think there's a little bit more to go on than the Spurs package. I think Shepherd, Jabari Smith, 2 former top picks. Tari Eason, very underrated player in my opinion. So there's a decent amount there. So if the Rockets stand strong and say, no, Şengün, Amen Thompson, not part of the deal, the Bucks may talk themselves into a big package like this. If they do, this might be a more likely scenario. It might be more likely that the Rockets say, yep, we are going for it. We're going to do a win now move like this. If it costs them Şengün, if it costs them Amen Thompson, I don't think they do it. And so that's why I think it's probably unlikely unless the Bucks cave and don't ask for one of those two. Next team up obviously isn't going to be popular, but that's the Los Angeles Lakers. You can pretty much ignore the offers that I have up here. Really, the only way that Giannis is going to be a Laker is if he pretty much says, hey, I want to be a Laker. And then at that point, the Bucks obviously would start with Austin Reeves, say Reeves has to be in the deal. If not, no deal. The Lakers then would come back and say, well, you don't have any leverage. Giannis wants to go to LA. He wants to play with Luka. We'll give you a couple of the picks we have. We'll give you all our role players and call it a day. Obviously, no, that is terrible value for Giannis. I would argue even the top is probably not that great of value. They can get plenty of other value in other teams' packages, but it's the Lakers. And if Giannis wants to play there, if he makes it clear either publicly or not, he's going to be a Laker. And so then the Bucks at that point are just kind of out of luck and they got to work with what they got. Is that likely? I don't think so. I don't think Giannis necessarily just wants to be a Laker. I don't think he's going to force himself there. But crazier things have happened. We didn't think Luka would be a Laker, and look, now here we are. So not super likely, not super high up, but we did need to bring them up in case that happens. Next team up is another popular team, and that's the Oklahoma City Thunder. If we're talking deadline deals, I think there's almost zero chance the Thunder make this trade. I think there's no chance they make this trade right now or in the next month before the deadline. However, if the Thunder struggle and if they don't get back to the finals, if they realize like, okay, hey, we had a good run last year, we're a really good team, but we're just missing something. And if somebody knocks them out early, I could see them having the conversation, let's get Giannis. Let's just go for it. We have a ton of assets. We have the most assets of anybody in the league, despite being the best team. And I think they at least have the conversation. Is it one of the most likely destinations? No. But it is the team that's kind of just floating in the background. If they wanted to, they could probably get Giannis. Now, the hard part of this potential deal, and you'll see in the two trades that I have listed here, it's going to be kind of hard to trade Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren, which would obviously be the first ask for Giannis. The Bucks would want either Jalen Williams or Chet, depending on who they like better. And depending on where the Thunder end up this season, they may be willing. They may be willing to trade one of those guys to get Giannis. But both of those guys have what's called poison pill contracts. They have signed their extensions from their rookie deals. And essentially what that means is if they get traded, and let's say this happens at the deadline, or they attempt to do this at the deadline, Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren would be counted as their rookie deal. Don't know exactly what that number is, but let's say it's $10 million for Jalen Williams. That's what he's being paid right now. The Thunder, on their side of the deal, would have $10 million outgoing, but the Bucks would be responsible, and it would be counted as the average of their full extended deal. And so both Jalen Williams and Chet have signed big deals. Let's say they're $50 million on average. The Bucks would be counted for $50 million on their side. And so when you're trying to do the math and you're trying to get the salaries to line up, it's really hard to get a deal done if one player counts as $10 million on one side, but $50 million on the other. And so because of that, it makes it difficult. Is it impossible? No. And if you want to get creative, potentially you could get a deal done, bring in a lot of different teams. I'm sure somebody can get creative and get it done. But I think for now, this is probably the best that the Bucks can get. And I think if I'm the Bucks and this trade was happening now, I'd want Cason Wallace. I'd want Aaron Wiggins. I'd want Topic, some young players. I'd also want as many first-round picks as the Thunder have, specifically the Clippers pick, which I don't have listed here. That one is potential to be in the lottery. We'll see how the Clippers end the season. But I'd want that pick. I'd want Utah's pick. I'd want any other first-round picks that the Thunder have. Again, if the Thunder want to do this deal, they can. Thunder would obviously just want to give their picks. They'd want to keep Cason Wallace. They'd want to keep Aaron Wiggins. If the Thunder wanted to, they could probably get this deal done. It's just a matter if they do. And then the last team that I think is probably not super likely is the Golden State Warriors. And they are another team that would be kind of hard to put a package together. I think this is kind of like the Lakers deal where it's probably not likely unless Giannis wants to go to Golden State. If he wants to play with Curry. If he does, either Jimmy Butler or Draymond Green has to be in the deal. That has to be part of it. And then the Bucks and Warriors can have their negotiation from there. Kuminga is obviously in the deal, but then take your pick. Moses Moody, Quinton Post, Will Richard, all these young guys that potentially could be in the deal. The best part of the deal, though, for the Bucks would be the picks. And they would be betting on the Warriors a few years down the line. If Steph retires, if Giannis then leaves after that, those Warriors picks in a few years are going to be very valuable. So that would be the best part of the deal. Because of that, I think it's probably better than the Lakers package. In both cases, though, I think it's Giannis would force his way there. I don't think the Bucks would seek out either of these offers, but we have to bring it up. It's the Lakers, it's the Warriors. Now let's get to some more likely scenarios. And the first one to me, probably the least likely of these more likely scenarios, would be the Atlanta Hawks. The Hawks are obviously a lot in rumors with Anthony Davis. We will talk about him in a little bit. If they wanted to make a bigger move, it would probably be Giannis. And if I'm the Bucks, obviously I would want Jalen Johnson back. If I'm the Hawks, I want to pair Jalen Johnson with Giannis. So the Hawks would argue it would have to be some deal either centered around Trae Young. Maybe they move him to a third team. Maybe this becomes a 3-team deal. But the Hawks would want to move Trae. They'd want to move Reese Shea, the former number 1 overall pick. And they'd want to trade as many picks as it takes. And they'd want to pair Giannis, Jalen Johnson, Onyeka Okongwu, and form what could be a pretty good front court. Would the Bucks do this? Trae Young is not the best of players, but he's not the worst player. I know he gets a lot of flack for his defense, rightfully so. But I think if the Bucks are kind of going into some sort of rebuild mode, especially if they don't get their picks back, they could do worse than Trae Young. And so I think some sort of deal would be probably created around him with Reese Shea. Maybe like a Dyson Daniels gets thrown in this deal as well if the Bucks want a little bit more. But I could see this deal happening. And I think this is one of the more likely destinations compared to the others that I think are more in theory and more probably people just hoping that it would happen. I think the Hawks are a little bit more realistic. Another team that I think is somewhat realistic, and that would be the Detroit Pistons. I was actually just talking about the Pistons the other day. I think they should make a win now move. I don't think they should be just content with being the 1 seed. It's a weak Eastern Conference. Who knows what that's going to look like in the next couple of years. But if you have a really good team and you have a chance to add Giannis, I would consider it. And I don't know if they necessarily have to make a big splash like Giannis. Someone like an Anthony Davis, someone like Kawhi, even somebody a little bit younger like a Trey Murphy, a Lauri Markkanen. Any of those players, I think, would help vault Detroit into actual serious contenders. And that's why I would consider doing it. Now, if they do want to consider Giannis, obviously the Bucks then would ask for Jalen Duren. He would be, again, one of the better trade assets that the Bucks could potentially get back. If I'm the Pistons, I say no. I obviously want to pair those two together. So they would have to really convince the Bucks that Jaden Ivey, Isaiah Stewart, I don't have Ron Holland listed there, but he could be included. And then all of their picks would be enough for Giannis. I don't know if there's quite enough. The Bucks may kind of talk themselves into a lot of first-round picks, which from the Pistons might not be great, especially if Cade and Giannis stay. But then maybe they'd be content with a bunch of good young, right now role players, but could grow into more in guys like Stewart, Ivy, Holland. I like the framework there, and I'm not saying the Pistons go all in, but if they wanted to, I think this is a good team for Giannis because I think there's enough there for the Bucks. There's a good team and a good young team for Giannis to grow with. I just don't know if the Pistons go all in, but I like this as one destination. The next team up is the Cavaliers, and they are the only team here that I don't have 2 trades listed for. I just have one 3-team deal in this instance, and that's because the Cavs are kind of a tricky team to make a Giannis trade for. And when I was first doing this, initially I just threw them aside. I said, nope, I don't think the Cavs would do it. Too complicated. I don't think they make the move. But the more and more the Cavs play, and the more and more that they struggle, I am starting to think that the Cavs maybe make this big move. And we can talk about this move in a second. But if the Cavs are going to struggle, the idea of kind of changing up their core and switching over to a core with Giannis and Donovan Mitchell, that I think is becoming more likely. Now, the problem is the Cavs are one of the few second apron teams, so that means they can't aggregate salary. Basically, that means Evan Mobley for Giannis, if you think that's a very fair trade, which Evan Mobley, one of the better players that the Bucks could get back, Mobley doesn't quite make enough for Giannis, and it's not as simple as taking 2 players for Giannis because the Cavs can't aggregate salary. They can't have multiple players to trade for one player. It's the rules that the NBA made up. It's the rules for being a second apron team. So if they want to trade for Giannis, this is one of the few trades that could make it work. And it essentially involves a third team with the Cavs getting under the second apron. In this instance, they're trading Max Strus to the Nets, giving the Nets a draft pick to take on his salary. That gets them under the second apron. Then they can make a trade with the Bucks. Because of this, it's either going to be a 3-team trade. They might be able to do a couple separate trades, but it's just not as simple as saying Mobley and some filler for Giannis. If that was, I think that would be a pretty straightforward trade. Because it's not, it's something like this. And if I'm the Cavs, I'm starting to get to the point where I would seriously consider this. And it's essentially swapping their front courts, going from Mobley and Jared Allen, which we have pretty strong evidence now that that's not working, and bringing in Giannis and Miles Turner to go along with Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland. You get older, you get probably only the next couple years to go for it instead of waiting for Evan Mobley to turn into potentially Giannis. But I think it's a trade that they would really consider. And so I've moved them up in the rankings. I do think in the offseason this could be a move that happens if the Cavaliers don't get where they want this year. And then the final 3 teams I have that to me are the most realistic. One of them is the Minnesota Timberwolves. I really like the Timberwolves as a Giannis destination. I really like the idea of him with Anthony Edwards. I think they are pretty similar to what each guy needs. I think Giannis needs a scoring guard, and I think Anthony Edwards needs a forward he can play off of. I think the idea of Giannis and Rudy Gobert, that front court defensively would be amazing. Offensively may struggle. I think then that's when you can bring in a Naz Reid if you end up keeping Naz Reid. So I really like Minnesota as I'll call them dark horse because I haven't seen a lot of people include them. Anthony Edwards and Giannis would be a lot of fun. I think they would be right up there with all the teams in the West, even though it's a stacked Western Conference. The question is then at that point is what can the Timberwolves offer the Bucks? I think any deal obviously starts with Julius Randle, whether the Bucks keep him at that point or maybe flip him to another team. He has to be in the deal. Then the question is, could the Bucks then also get Jaden McDaniels, who has his flaws, but is a really good player? I think that combination of Randle, McDaniels, if they can get Naz Reid in the deal, a couple young players with it, that's a decent deal for the Bucks. Now, I think that's probably too much for the Timberwolves. I think they'd want to keep McDaniels and Reid and just have a better team around Giannis and Anthony Edwards. So then the question is, would the Bucks be okay with Julius Randle taking a chance on Rob Dillingham, Terrence Shannon Jr., add in some picks as well? Would that be enough for the Bucks? You might have to throw McDaniels in. You might have to throw Naz Reid in. It's probably somewhere in the middle, but as a destination, I really like Giannis to Minnesota. That would be one of my picks if I could pick where Giannis went. Next team up is the Miami Heat. Another team that I think is probably realistic, especially if we get to the offseason. Giannis in the Heat culture with Eric Spoelstra. Depending on what they gave up, the Heat may not be as good of a contender as some of the teams that we've talked about. But I think just putting Giannis in the Heat system, I think that would be a team he'd want to go to, an organization he'd want to go to. It's then just a question of how much do you have to take of what's working for the Heat, but how much of that do you have to take to get Giannis? Because if they could just place Giannis on their team, I think they'd be a championship contender. Problem is, obviously, the Bucks would want something back. So then that's the question. The Bucks, they would want Bam. They would want Kel'el Ware. I think they would be okay with a trade mainly centered around those two. Heat would obviously want to keep those guys. They'd want to put probably Bam and Giannis together. Potentially a shaky fit, but I think that would be a really fun front court. They would want it to be focused around Tyler Hero, giving them some first-round picks, giving them some young players. I would argue probably Kel'el Ware would be in the deal. I don't think the Bucks do it without him. They could probably be convinced to do a deal with Tyler Hero, Ware, a couple other young guys, some first-round picks, and then the Heat with Giannis, Bam, Wiggins would still be there, Norman Powell would still be there. That would be a really fun team. And if Giannis wants to go to a contender, he probably wants to go to the Eastern Conference, just because of how loaded the West is. And Giannis on that Heat team would be really fun. And so I think if Giannis gets moved, potentially at this deadline, but then definitely in the offseason, the Heat are going to be a team to watch because I think they have enough to convince the Bucks to make a trade and still have enough left over to make a good team. And then I just trust the Heat organization more than probably any other team that we've talked about. So Giannis to the Heat, I think, is one of the more likely scenarios. And then the only other team that is probably more likely, and that's the New York Knicks. The main reason, obviously, that I have it as one of the most likely scenarios is we've gotten a lot of rumors that Giannis wants to go to New York. He wants to play for the Knicks. The Knicks have obviously been hunting stars for a long time. The only reason I think this might not happen is the trade would obviously have to be a pretty much star for star trade, depending on what you feel of Karl Anthony Towns. But that is pretty much all that the Knicks have to offer. And the two trades I have listed here are pretty similar. The Bucks would obviously want Towns, and whether they keep him or if this is a bigger deal where they move some of these guys for young players. But Towns would have to be in the deal. The Bucks would then argue and say, well, the difference between Towns and Giannis still pretty big in terms of value. So we would want either an OG Anunoby, a Mikal Bridges. We'd want another good player in that, and then probably the only first-round pick that the Knicks can give after trading them all for Bridges. That would be the sticking point, is how much do the Knicks have to add outside of Towns? That would be probably one of the holdups for the trade. The other only holdup that I could see of why this wouldn't happen, and if Giannis wants to go to the New York, why the Knicks might say, yeah, no, we're okay, is based on how the Knicks do this season. Because if the Knicks make the finals, and whether or not they win, I don't think they would then trade what's working for Giannis. And if it has to be Towns, Anunoby, maybe throw in a Miles McBride or Tyler Kolek, if they have to move a couple guys from what is right now a rotation that's working, I don't know if the Bucks would say yes, which is crazy to think about. But I think that would be the only thing that would hold this up, is if the Knicks have a lot of success, they're not then going to just turn around and trade for Giannis. But if they struggle, if Giannis officially wants out this offseason, I think the Knicks are a pretty likely scenario. So that was Giannis. Obviously, the bigger name, the better player, the better asset at this point compared to Anthony Davis. But I do want to do this same exercise now for Anthony Davis. And we're probably not going to have as many teams because Anthony Davis, as I said, not as good of an asset. But I want to go through the same exercise for Anthony Davis because I think he is more likely to get traded this deadline than Giannis. So let's throw up the same 29 teams, or I guess slightly different because now we have the Bucks instead of the Mavericks. But we'll throw up the 29 teams. Same thing. We're going to go through a little process of elimination. Same first question as Giannis, as does Anthony Davis fit your timeline? And the results are a little bit different than Giannis. You would think, does Giannis fit your timeline? Does Anthony Davis fit their timeline? It's the same. They're the same age. I think it'd be slightly different because for Giannis, you're trading a lot. As we saw for all those trades, you have to trade pretty much the farm to get Giannis. And you don't have to do that for Anthony Davis. A lot of it is because he is obviously just not quite as good. A little bit more of a health risk. Although Giannis, I think at this point, a little bit risky. But Anthony Davis is certainly a health risk. And as an asset, I think Anthony Davis is pretty low right now. And so you could get away with some decent packages. And obviously you have to convince Dallas to trade Anthony Davis, but you don't have to give up a ton. And so for some of these teams that maybe Giannis didn't quite fit their timeline, just pushing all their chips all in, but doing a slightly smaller move for someone who is not as good as Giannis, but maybe when he's right, 75% of Giannis, that might be a little bit different. And so I've crossed off 8 teams, slightly different combination than for Giannis. Second question is, do you need to take the risk? And this is where it's different than Giannis. If you're a really good team, you don't need to take the risk of Anthony Davis. And Giannis is obviously a risk because he's been getting hurt too the last few years. And you are obviously trading a ton for Giannis. But Anthony Davis is way more of a risk. It is way more likely that you trade for him in the hopes for getting a potential championship player and he just gets hurt and you've lost him for the year. So I think a lot of the good teams, a lot of the teams we talked about for Giannis, like the Thunder, the Knicks, the Rockets, the Spurs, even the Cavs, the Nuggets, they don't need to take the risk. They obviously could use Anthony Davis, but they don't need to. And so I think for those teams that are good the way they are, they don't need to take the risk. Next criteria is, do you have a need for Anthony Davis' skill set? Similar to Giannis, I'm going to be a little bit more strict though, because I think everybody could use Giannis. And by the same thought, everybody could use Anthony Davis. but he's a little bit more limited. Again, not as good as Giannis. So that is going to eliminate a lot of the teams that don't necessarily need a big, don't necessarily need a rim protector like AD. And so that takes off a majority of the teams. So that leaves 9 teams, not as much as Giannis, but 9 teams left. One final criteria, though, because we're just not even going to go down that path, and that is, has Anthony Davis played for your team before? And that's going to eliminate the Lakers. Could the Lakers use Anthony Davis? Yes, very much so. And if you're talking about trades that could fix the Lakers, Anthony Davis would be up there. A defensive anchor, could be a lob threat for Luka, could maybe not cost as much, obviously, as a Giannis, so you could make a trade a little bit easier. But there's no way that Dallas is trading AD back to the Lakers. Like, I know that Nico's not there. I know sunk cost, doesn't matter what happened before. But just the PR nightmare that would be, no way that's happening. So we can just cross them off. We don't need to talk about potential trade. So then that leaves 8 teams left that could be in the market for Anthony Davis. And same thing, we're going to go through least likely to most likely of who would trade for Anthony Davis. Similar to Giannis, the first team I have up is the Boston Celtics. I do think this is a little bit more likely than Giannis because Anthony Davis is going to be cheaper than Giannis, as I keep mentioning. And I do like this fit for Boston because Boston is not very far off from being a very serious contender again. And if Tatum comes back, really the only thing they're missing is another big. And I really like Neemias Queta. He's been really solid for Boston as their starting big. I think they need somebody else to go along with him. And in this case, obviously then Queta could be a really good backup big. But if you could pair Anthony Davis with Tatum and Brown, with Derek White, although we'll talk about him because he's in the trade, with Peyton Pritchard, that's a very good team. And I think Davis would put the Celtics over the top. We know that the Celtics have been interested before in Anthony Davis. Obviously, this was back when he was healthier and better. But as I mentioned for Giannis, I could see the Celtics and I could see Brad Stevens saying, hey, this is a very good player and he's potentially a distressed asset. Could we get this deal done without really affecting our team? And I think then the question would be, would Derek White be in the trade? And I have him pretty much being the focal point. I don't think Dallas gets this deal done without him because Tatum, Brown, they're obviously off the table. Maybe like a Peyton Pritchard, maybe just a Neemias Queta, a Jordan Walsh, a Hugo Gonzalez. Maybe that's enough for Dallas. But I do think they'd want something, and I think that something would be Derek White. The question then for Boston is, Derek White just flat out more valuable than Anthony Davis? And I think there are a lot of people that would say yes. I think a lot of people are out on Anthony Davis, and I get that. I get he's not healthy and he's not playing. But I do think people are forgetting how just valuable Anthony Davis is when he plays. And that's going to be a theme as I talk about all these teams. Yes, some of these teams might be giving up a little bit too much. And even that bottom offer, a lot of people might say the Celtics might not even offer that. But Anthony Davis, when he's healthy, is still a very, very good player. Yes, I get when he's healthy is the key. But for a team like the Celtics, would they take that risk? I think they would be a dark horse, but I still think they're least likely. So they're first up here. Next team up is a team we didn't talk about for Giannis, and that's the Charlotte Hornets. Another trade that is kind of an interesting one to put together because on the one hand, the Hornets are a young team, not a very good team, but they are building. And at some point, teams that are in this kind of point in their rebuild need to make a move to kind of push them into the playoffs, kind of push them into contention. And I don't think Anthony Davis would really even get them close to like championship contention. But if I'm the Hornets and I have what is now at least a fun trio of LaMelo, Knipple, and Brandon Miller, would they say, hey, let's get an Anthony Davis, let's get a defensive anchor for us? Those three, not exactly 3-star defensive players. Could Anthony Davis kind of help anchor us on defense, help push us into contention? And even though he might not help us get over the top, for the Hornets, getting over the top right now means being an actual like playoff team. And I think Anthony Davis would do that. Now, same thing for the Celtics. I have Miles Bridges as kind of the main return. It's kind of hard to tell what Bridges' value is right now. Some people might argue it's more than Anthony Davis. But when Davis plays, he's obviously way better than Miles Bridges. I think Dallas could be convinced. Add Miles Bridges, add Colin Sexton. A little bit younger of guys. Pair with Cooper Flagg. I think that might be enough. would Charlotte make this move? They're not really going all in, so I think they might, but I think still somewhat unlikely, but I wanted to throw them out there. Next up is the Miami Heat. For Giannis, I think they are very serious contenders. For Anthony Davis, I think probably not so serious contenders. And that's just the difference in play styles and then health. I don't think Miami would really go down the risk of Anthony Davis. I think they would go down that risk for Giannis. Anthony Davis, to me, doesn't quite fit the Heat culture. And that comes from somebody who's a huge Anthony Davis fan, but I don't think that's really what they're looking for. Now, if they could get away with just trading maybe Wiggins, Rozier for salary and 1 first-round pick, maybe they do that. And they say, hey, let's put Anthony Davis and Bam similar to Giannis and Bam. That would be a fun defensive-minded front court. If Dallas wants a Tyler Hero, if they want some of their young guys, then I think Miami probably says, no, we're okay. So I only include them if Dallas kind of sells low on Anthony Davis. If not, I don't think this is a realistic option. Next package is the Toronto Raptors. I know a lot of people think Giannis is a good destination for Toronto. I don't know if I really see it because I think what you would have to give up, Giannis with a more bare Toronto team, they'd be better than what Milwaukee is, but I get too much of a sense that it would be kind of a similar situation. So I don't know if they go big for Giannis, but Giannis and especially Anthony Davis seem like Toronto players. And if you've followed Toronto for the last really half decade, Anthony Davis seems like a player they would want. And if they could get away with essentially swapping out Jakob Poeltl for Davis, I think they would do it. Then the question is how much more in addition to Jakob Poeltl would Dallas want? You could argue that a younger big, maybe a first-round pick, maybe they can get Colin Murray-Boyles. I think Toronto would be interested. I don't know if there's enough that Dallas would be interested in this, unless obviously one of their bigger players was on the table. But Anthony Davis in Toronto's system, with all the length they have, they'd be one of the best defensive teams. So I like that fit. Is there a trade in there that works? I'm not quite sure, but I think it's an option to throw out there. And then that leaves 4 teams, which I think are probably the most realistic for Anthony Davis. I would be shocked if he doesn't go to one of these 4 teams. And one of them is the Golden State Warriors. This trade is actually what started this whole thing. This is why I wanted to make this video. I think Golden State, as I mentioned for Giannis, probably not a realistic option unless Giannis forces himself there. But if a team is going to take the risk on Anthony Davis, and you could argue that a lot of these teams wouldn't, even the ones that I'm bringing up, you need to find a team that is desperate, that is okay with Anthony Davis being a little bit older, is still really good when he plays, but they don't really have any other option. That's pretty much the Warriors. And then the question is, would the Warriors be okay with giving up Jimmy Butler? Because in a perfect world, the Warriors would want to add Anthony Davis to what they have. And I think that's the only scenario where they become at least semi-legit contenders in the West, is if they added Anthony Davis along with Draymond, along with Jimmy Butler, along with Steph. Problem is, salary-wise, you have to get rid of either Jimmy or Draymond. Could the Warriors trade Draymond for Anthony Davis? They could. In that situation, Draymond would probably get routed to the Lakers or somewhere else. But would the Warriors really break up Draymond and Steph for Anthony Davis? They could, depending on how that relationship is going. Or would they be okay with trading Jimmy pretty much a year after they got him and say, hey, this trade worked for a little bit. This experiment kind of worked, but I think we're ready to move on. Would they swap out Jimmy for Anthony Davis? And then at that point, this is probably a 3-team deal. If it is Jimmy Butler, he would probably go somewhere else. Another team would send a few assets back to Dallas. I think this could happen because I think a combination of Kuminga, other assets you get for Jimmy Butler could be enough for Dallas to be like, okay, that's a good enough deal. And I think the Warriors are desperate enough that they would also do this. So is this the best deal for both teams? No, but I also think both teams would be desperate enough to make this deal. The next realistic team for Anthony Davis is the Detroit Pistons. I don't know if they will go all in for Giannis, but as I've said, and as I talked about last week, I would really want to see Detroit make a move like this. I don't know if I want to see them go all in for Giannis, but if they could get away with really just trading one of their young core pieces and Tobias Harris for salary reasons for Anthony Davis, I think this could be a good move for them. And in the scenario I have them offering Dallas, if they could convince Dallas that Ron Holland, a first round pick and some salary is enough for Anthony Davis, I think that could be a good move. Because imagine pairing Cade, Anthony Davis, Jalen Duren. You still have Asar Thompson. You still have Jaden Ivey. You still have Javonte Green. You still have Duncan Robinson. That right there is a good playoff rotation. And they would be a really, really good defensive team. They already are a really good defensive team. But Anthony Davis would make it even better. And I think it gives them just another option on offense. That's just not Cade, just trying to figure everything out. So I would really like to see Detroit do this. I don't know if they would, and you could argue maybe Dallas would want too much for what Detroit would offer. But if they do, I think this is a move that helps Detroit for this year. And I don't think they should just be content with their youth, with just kind of where they're at. If they have a chance to make the finals with this team, and Anthony Davis can help that, I would want to see it. We'll see if they actually make that move, but I would like to see it happen. Next realistic trade option is Anthony Davis' hometown team in the Chicago Bulls. I feel like that's kind of the only reason why people bring it up. And I mean, it's also just a very Chicago Bulls move to make. You know, a team that has pretty much just been stuck in the play-in ever since the play-in was invented. Anthony Davis, again, in theory, is a very good player, so I don't want to lump him in with this. But where Davis is in his career, it seems like a very Chicago Bulls thing to do. And if there are no other teams that really want to do it, if Dallas is set on trading him, I think the Bulls consider it just because he's a hometown guy. When he's right, he's still a really good player. And him with Josh Giddey, with Ayo Dosunmu, if you can keep him, with Kobe White, depending on what they do with him. Davis with a lot of fun guards would be a fun team. And Chicago needs defensive help. Davis would obviously help with that. Then the question is, what trade happens? And similar to some of these other teams, the Bulls might argue that, hey, if we're trading you Vucevic, who's a different player than Davis, but still been a good player for Chicago, Chicago would argue, hey, those guys are pretty similar. And, you know, we'll give you maybe a first-round pick. You got to take back Patrick Williams' contract, and we'll call it a day. I don't think it's quite enough for Dallas. They would probably ask for Ayo. They would ask for a couple first-round picks. If they meet in the middle, this seems like the most realistic Davis trade. Not the most exciting. Don't know if I would love this, but I could see it happening. And then the most realistic option is the one that has been rumored a lot the last couple of weeks, and that's the Atlanta Hawks. And we're going to talk more specifically about these trade options because this is starting to look like the likely scenario. If I'm Dallas and Atlanta has had interest and they want to add Anthony Davis, it's already been rumored that Zachary Risache would kind of be the focal point of the deal. I honestly wouldn't hate that if I'm Dallas. And I know a lot of people are out on Risache, and for a lot of reasons, that's rightfully so. If you take away the fact he was the first overall pick, and you just look at the player as he is, it's still an intriguing player, and it's still an intriguing asset. Yes, a lot of people are looking at this year and looking at his struggles this year. But last year, as a rookie, yes, he wasn't going to live up to the number one overall pick hype. We probably could see that right away just based on the lack of just top-end talent, the fact that the Hawks really didn't have a number one guy they liked up until the end. So he was always going to be one of the worst first overall picks we've seen. But he showed a lot of signs last year. He showed that he could be, when he's right, a really good shooter. He's got length. He's got some size. That's a good player in today's NBA. And so if I'm Dallas, and if the Hawks are essentially going to be selling low on Risache, I would take advantage of it because he fits Cooper Flagg's timeline a lot better than Anthony Davis. And if I could pair him with a couple other shots, whether that's a couple more first-round picks, whether that's Onyeka Okongwu, who, if I'm Dallas, I would want. If I'm Atlanta, I don't think I would even consider that. But I think they ask for some of those pieces. That, I think, is an okay trade for Davis. Now, what you can't do is you can't say, oh, well, we just traded Luka for Anthony Davis, and now we're trading Davis for what is probably the worst first-round pick in a long time, and maybe a first-round pick or two. You just can't do that if you're Dallas. It is a sunk cost, and unless you're trading him back to the Lakers, which I said is never going to happen, you can't think of the past. You can't think of the past when you're making this deal. And I think Dallas then says, Davis is still a good player, but he's a declining asset. We're not going to be good this year. You know, we might not be good for the next couple years, depending on how Cooper Flagg develops. So why not get another shot at a player at Cooper Flag's kind of timeline, I think that's what they should do. Continue to tank this season. It's the one first round pick they have left. Get a good player in the draft. Get Reece Shea. Get a couple maybe smaller assets, and just call it a deal. And get away from all this Luka AD stuff. It happened. Trade Davis now while you can, and I think that's the reason Dallas does it. Why Atlanta does it is, I don't know if they should be selling low on Reece Shea, but if they want to get out of that, if you can trade Reece Shea, who's obviously been a disappointment, and maybe a first round pick, maybe two, maybe a smaller player, and get Anthony Davis, again, seems like kind of an Atlanta thing to do. Would they then trade Trae Young? I don't know. That would be the next question. We can talk about that next video. But pairing Jalen Johnson, Anthony Davis, and Onyeka Okongwu, it's a good team, and it's a team you can build around. Would that vault them into championship contention? I don't think so. Would they be taking on risk with Anthony Davis? Certainly. But I think it's a move Atlanta's interested in because they can get a really good player for a lower price, and they need to shake things up right now. So I think that's why Atlanta does it. So it makes sense why this is the trade. Makes sense why this is the destination. If it's not Atlanta, I think it's Chicago. I think maybe Golden State might get involved. One of the other teams I mentioned. But as of right now, Anthony Davis to Atlanta seems the most likely. So that was all the trades to get through. All the trades for Giannis. All the trades for Anthony Davis. As I mentioned at the top, I don't think Giannis gets moved at the deadline, but I do think one of the trades we talked about will happen in the offseason. And then Anthony Davis, I think probably gets moved this deadline. I know Dallas keeps saying, we want to see what Kyrie, what Cooper Flag, what Anthony Davis can look like together. I think that's just them essentially trying to drive up the price for Anthony Davis and say, oh, we don't have to trade him. We want to see what this team could look like. You know, when Anthony Davis plays, we're a decent team. I think Dallas would be dumb to not trade Davis now. I think they need to ignore everything that happened with Luka. You need to trade him now while he has some value and you can get something back, whether that's a Reece Shea from Atlanta or something else. But I do think Anthony Davis gets moved. So that would be my prediction about a month out now from the trade deadline. I think Davis gets moved. Giannis gets moved at the offseason. But whenever the trade happens, we will talk obviously more about the trades, the players, and just more about the deals when they happen. But for now, that will do it. As I mentioned, if you liked any of this, if you want to see other players, I might do a few more of these videos with some smaller players. If you liked it, want to see more, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I've got NBA trade value lists coming out, I think, at the end of the month. We got other trade stuff happening in the NBA, and then a bunch of other things in the NFL, MLB, lots of fun stuff happening the next couple months. So make sure to subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.